Olá, sou Márcio Francisquini, diretor comercial do Canadá, responsável pelo desenvolvimento de negócios no setor de infraestrutura. Bem-vindo a mais um podcast da série Transporte do Canadá. Hoje apresento a segunda parte da entrevista feita pela Daniel Bellemare, Vice-Presidente de Vendas da DLL Inc, uma empresa de Montreal, com o Daniel Bellemare, especialista em locomotivas, com mais de 40 anos de experiência no setor ferroviário. Nessa segunda parte da entrevista, Daniel explica as diferenças entre locomotivas com tração AC e DC, bem como as características e vantagens de cada uma. Apreciem o vídeo.
Hi guys, my name is Daniel Leblanc. I'm Vice President Sales and Marketing and Associate at DLL Inc. Thank you very much for joining us on this second podcast. Hope you enjoy and learn while watching our first edition. It was talking about locomotive evolution. For the ones who saw our first podcast, we finished by talking about the two major North American locomotive builders. That being said, the industry produced two types of traction for diesel electric locomotive, AC and DC. And this is where I said to myself, I want to go deeper into that subject. So that's why, here we are today talking about the AC and DC traction diesel locomotives. So again, Daniel, that was also my guest on the first podcast. Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Annie.
How are you?
I'm doing very fine, and I'm very happy to be here discussing railway innovations with you and your podcast followers.
So ready to jump into the water?
Yes, I am. As ready as I can be.
Excellent. So, okay. Well, I've been told several times, Danielle, that the AC traction locomotives were among the most significant technology introduced. So, tell me, what's your thoughts about this?
Well, Annie, most of the North American Class 1 railroads have determined that AC traction is more cost-effective on heavy hauls such as coal trains and grain trains. And DC traction locomotives are most cost-effective on non-unit trains. Although NS has decided that DC is the way to go for everything, and CSX has decided to go with AC for every kind of train. The decision is mainly based on the railway characteristic, the mix traffic, and the operating plan.
Okay, so can you please tell me what is the major differences between AC and DC traction?
Well, Annie, the major difference between AC and DC traction in running trains is that the train powered with AC traction locomotive have a very low horsepower per ton ratio and still move without exceeding the heating limits of the traction motors. AC traction motors can run to a stall, and full current without damaging the traction motors, whereas the DC traction motors will quickly overheat and at low speed and full current, and often experience fatal damage to their major components.
Okay, well, is there anything else that makes difference between AC and DC?
Yes, the management of current to the traction motors in both AC and DC traction locomotives. The diesel engine drives the AC main generator, also called the traction alternator, which generates AC current being rectified to DC by diodes that powers a DC traction motor on a DC traction locomotive.
Okay, well, what about the AC traction locomotives?
Well, on the AC traction locomotive, the diesel engine still drives the same AC traction alternator, which generates AC current, being rectified by DC to DC by diodes. From that point, it differs. The DC current is converted to AC, which powers the AC traction motors.
Okay, so why the AC locomotive goes from AC to DC then back to AC? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'll try to explain the best way that I can.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, you're right. It's pretty difficult to answer. So if you don't mind, I'll be looking at my notes a few times during this podcast. Thank you. So the answer resides in the way that the DC rectification provides a cleaner current, which is used by the current inverters to create the proper frequency for the AC traction motors.
Okay, well, So what do you mean exactly?
Well, the evolution of current inverters made possible, a principle called variable voltage, variable frequency drive, which is specific to all AC motors.
Okay, whoa, Daniel. Good that you're looking at your notes because this is very technical for me. I understand that you have a very technical background, but for us ordinary people, can you please simplify?
Well, I will try to do my best. So in layman terms, it essentially means better control of power versus the speed of the traction motor armature.
Okay, and is this the reason why AC tractions would be more cost effective?
No, Annie. The DC traction locomotive was the industry standard for many, many years. But the evolution of AC traction motors and IGBT, replacing the old GTOs, made it possible for Wabtec and Progress Rail to come up with AC traction locomotives in the early 1990s.
Okay, for the ones who are not aware, is that a few years back, GE got acquired by Wabtec and EMD was acquired by Progress Rail, which is a Caterpillar company. So, sorry Daniel for interrupting. I thought I'd share that information for all of us.
You're all excused, no problem, Annie. So since the early 1990s, more improvement took place and will probably continue on this direction. AC traction motors have less maintenance and fewer failures, which equals a better reliability rate. With less maintenance, since there are no brushes or brush holders to renew on traction motor or commutator to inspect.
Okay, well, you spoke a lot about the AC traction being the biggest difference between the DC and AC traction locomotives. Are the traction motors the only aspect worth mentioning?
No, Annie, the main electrical high voltage compartments are significantly different.
So how different, Daniel?
Well, a new electrical compartment was created on the AC traction locomotives to accommodate the current inverters, also known as IGBTs. This compartment is made up of modules which are cooled by ventilation ducting to prevent overheating failures on electronic components. Also, AC traction locomotives have a lot more electronics and are usually driven by a main computer. Like in the EMD locomotive, it's called the EM2000. These onboard computers have greatly improved the troubleshooting to address online failures.
Oh, this is very interesting, but doesn't this help also go in the same direction, in terms of cost effectiveness?
Absolutely. Some older contactors and relays have been completely replaced by electronic panel, thus ensuring greater component reliability. Although some complex panels make it mandatory to work exclusively with original manufacturers, it is not always the most economical option, but it is the fastest.
So that is very interesting, Daniel. So what about the DC traction locomotive? What are there more advantages to use for a railroad?
Well, Annie, it comes down to the duty cycle.
Okay, what is a duty cycle?
Well, the duty cycle is the ratio between when a locomotive is being active, either working on the main line or in the rail yard, versus the time it's not active. So either waiting to be put on a train or waiting for the duty cycle to start.
Okay.
With that being said, AC traction locomotives are usually used on heavy haul trains, which duty cycle is usually longer. And DC traction locomotives are usually being used on rail yard, switching, way freight, or smaller trains with shorter duty cycles.
Okay. Well, this is really interesting, Daniel, really. And I thank you very much for taking the time to do this podcast with us. I know you've done a lot of research, trying also to find the right information, and I appreciate that the time you put together all this work.
Thank you, Annie, and sorry for the blunders, but I did the best I could.
And we appreciate that, really. And I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time to look at this podcast. I hope you enjoy the experience and also I did learn a lot. Me not being as much as Daniel in the railroad industry, it's always interesting to know a little bit more. So don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the video. Stay tuned for our next podcast. This is Annie Leblanc for DLL. If you want to have more details on DLL, go on our website at www.dllinc.com. Cheers, guys.
So long, folks.